On July 18, 2012, Nokia's stock hit €1.33. The company that once made half the phones on Earth, that accounted for 4% of Finland's entire GDP, had just lost 98% of its value. Bankruptcy was inevitable, but Nokia refused to die. They sold their phone business to Microsoft, bought a French-American telecom giant, and spent the next decade rebuilding themselves into something completely different. In late October 2025, at Nvidia's GTC conference in Washington, Jensen Huang invested $1 billion in Nokia.
We have a big partnership with Nokia.
The CEO of Nokia said the partnership would put an AI data center into everyone's pocket. This is the story of how Nokia went from inevitable bankruptcy to telecom giant, and then became Nvidia's billion. In 1865, a Finnish engineer named Fredrik Idestam built a paper mill in southern Finland. At the time, Finland was still part of the Russian Empire, and paper was one of its few growing industries. 6 years later, he and his friend Leo Mechelin formed a company called Nokia AB, named after the town where the second mill was built along the river. A century later, the company merged with two other Finnish companies, Finnish Rubber Works, which made tires and boots, and Finnish Cable Works, which made telephone and telegraph cables. Together, they formed Nokia Corporation. The company entered the mobile phone business in 1979 through a joint venture called Mobira. Back then, mobile phones were a luxury for executives and the ultra-wealthy. 3 years later, they released their first phone, the Mobira Senator, a car phone that weighed nearly 10 kilograms, designed to be installed in vehicles. But even then, mobile phones were a small part of Nokia's business. The company still made most of its money from cables, rubber, and consumer electronics. In 1992, a 41-year-old executive named Jorma Ollila became CEO. He had been running Nokia's mobile phone division, a struggling unit that most of the board wanted to sell. But Ollila saw something others didn't, the coming wave of digital cellular networks. So he made a bet: sell off the paper mills, the rubber factories, and the cable business. Keep only mobile phones. By 1994, Nokia was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. What happened next was unprecedented. Within 6 years, Nokia wasn't just selling phones, they were reshaping an entire country. By 2000, the company accounted for 4% of Finland's GDP and 70% of the Helsinki stock market. Their market cap hit €303 billion. That same year, they released the 3310. It sold 126 million units worldwide and introduced an entire generation to a game called Snake. It also became famous for being indestructible. By 2007, Nokia controlled nearly 40% of the global mobile phone market, more than their three closest rivals combined. But that year, Steve Jobs had other plans. On January 9th, 2007, Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone.
And we are calling it iPhone.
Within days, Nokia put together an internal presentation analyzing the threat. 9 employees, some with C-level positions, concluded that the iPhone was a serious challenger in the high-end segment and that its touchscreen interface could set a new standard for the entire market. Management wasn't convinced. They had their engineers tear the iPhone apart and found plenty to dismiss. It was expensive to manufacture, failed their drop test, and didn't have a physical keyboard. To Nokia, the iPhone was a niche product, fragile, overpriced, and missing basic features their customers expected. For a while, the numbers proved them right. By the end of 2007, Nokia controlled 50% of the smartphone market, while Apple had less than 3%. A year later, Nokia sold 468 million phones. It was their best year ever. But the market was shifting. That same year, HTC and Google released the first Android phone. Nokia was no longer the only alternative to Apple. Now there were two ecosystems pulling developers and customers away. Nokia's response came in 2009, the N97. It had a 5-megapixel camera, a slide-out keyboard, GPS, twice the storage of the iPhone, and a touchscreen. Nokia called it the iPhone killer. The phone sold 2 million units in the first 3 months, but the experience was a disaster. The touchscreen was unresponsive, Symbian crashed when running more than a few apps, and Nokia's App Store had launched with around 1,000 applications, while Apple's already had more than 50 times that, meaning most of the apps users wanted simply didn't exist. A few months later, Nokia publicly apologized. Anssi Vanjoki, Nokia's executive VP of markets, called the N97 a tremendous disappointment.
It has been a tremendous disappointment in terms of the experience quality for the consumers.
In September 2010, the board hired Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive, to turn the company around. He was the first non-Finnish CEO in Nokia's history. He spent his first months figuring out what went wrong. 5 months later, he sent a company-wide memo that would become the most famous memo of the decade. Nokia, he told them, was standing on a burning platform. Symbian was the fire. Apple had redefined the smartphone. Android was gaining ground fast. Nokia had two choices: stay and burn or jump. His answer: abandon Symbian and switch to Microsoft's Windows Phone. Elop chose Windows over Android for one reason: differentiation. On Android, Nokia would be just another manufacturer fighting Samsung. With Windows Phone, they could own the platform. The speech was meant to rally employees. Instead, it leaked to the press within days. Elop had just told the world that Nokia's software was dead, and that anyone buying a Symbian phone was buying a dead end. By the next quarter, smartphone sales had dropped by more than a third. Nokia's first Windows phones arrived in late 2011, the Lumia 800 and Lumia 710. But the App Store was nearly empty. Developers had already committed to iOS and Android. Over the next 2 years, Nokia sold 36 million Lumia phones, while Apple sold 150 million iPhones in 2013 alone. When Elop joined Nokia in 2010, they had 33% of the smartphone market. When he left in 2014, they had less than 3%. Nokia's stock had peaked at €65 in 2000. By July 2012, it hit €1.33, a 98% collapse. The company that once made half the phones on Earth was now on the edge of bankruptcy. But behind the headlines, Nokia's chairman was already planning something else entirely. In May 2012, Risto Siilasmaa became chairman of Nokia at the lowest point in the company's history. The numbers were brutal. Revenues dropped another 20% that year. Operating losses hit €2.3 billion. A company that had already lost 98% of its value was still falling. The press wasn't asking if Nokia would go bankrupt. They were asking when. Siilasmaa later described what came next as removing the engines, the cabin, and the wings of an airplane in mid-flight, and reassembling the airplane to look completely different. His strategy was counterintuitive. In January 2013, Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer called Siilasmaa to discuss acquiring Nokia's phone business. At first, Siilasmaa resisted. He still believed they could turn it around. But as the losses kept mounting, he realized the only way to save Nokia was to let the phones go.
The biggest phone deals ever. Microsoft taking on Samsung and Apple and buying Nokia's smartphone business.
In September 2013, Microsoft announced it would acquire Nokia's phone business for $7.2 billion. But Nokia wasn't just selling. They were repositioning. Nokia had always had a second business that most people forgot about: network infrastructure. Since 2007, they'd been running it as a joint venture with Siemens, the German engineering giant. Before the Microsoft deal was even announced, Nokia bought out Siemens half for €1.7 billion. For the first time, Nokia owned the entire network business outright. The logic was simple. Stop making the phones, start making the networks that every phone depends on. Less than 2 years later, Microsoft wrote off $7.6 billion on the Nokia acquisition, more than the entire purchase price, and eliminated 7,800 jobs. Nokia had sold a sinking ship and walked away with $7.2 billion in cash, their patents, and a network business they fully owned. The phone company that lost everything had just pulled off the best exit in tech history. But leaving a dying industry is one thing, conquering a new one is another. In May 2014, Rajiv Suri became CEO. Unlike Elop, he wasn't hired from outside. He was the one who'd made the network division profitable in the first place. Now he had to turn it into something bigger. After the Microsoft deal, Nokia was already heading in a good direction. They had funds and 3 businesses left: networks, now fully owned after buying out Siemens, a mapping service called Here, Nokia Technologies for patent licensing. But there was a problem. Ericsson and Huawei, the 2 largest telecom companies at the time, sold complete portfolios. Nokia only had wireless. To compete, they needed to build end-to-end networks, not just radio towers, but the entire infrastructure that connects them. In April 2015, Suri made his move. Nokia announced it would acquire Alcatel-Lucent, a French-American telecom giant, for €15.6 billion. Alcatel-Lucent had the pieces Nokia was missing, including IP routing, fixed networks, and optical transport. Suri called the new Nokia the Western alternative to Huawei. There was another reason Suri wanted Alcatel-Lucent. The company owned Bell Labs, one of the most awarded research labs in history, the birthplace of the first cellular networks, with over 20,000 patents. With Bell Labs, Nokia had the R&D firepower to lead 5G. Over the next year, Nokia sold Here Maps and finalized the Alcatel-Lucent acquisition. By 2017, enterprise value had grown 20 times from its 2012 low, but Huawei and Ericsson still dominated the market. In January 2018, Bell Labs delivered. Nokia unveiled ReefShark, a 5G chipset that tripled bandwidth to 84 gigabits per second while cutting power consumption by 64%. 30 operators signed on to test it. Then Huawei's luck ran out.
The Trump administration is cracking down on Chinese telecom giant Huawei. Now this effectively is banning it from doing business with American companies.
In May 2019, the United States banned them from American networks. For 2 decades, Huawei had dominated the industry by undercutting rivals by around 30%. Now the biggest player was locked out of the biggest market. Britain followed over a year later, ordering carriers to strip Huawei equipment from 5G networks by 2027. Across the West, carriers needed a new vendor and Nokia stepped in. They won BT, Britain's largest operator, and in the US they signed contracts with AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. By October 2020, Nokia had 100 commercial 5G deals. Suri's Western alternative to Huawei wasn't a slogan anymore, but Nokia's 5G wins wouldn't last long. Over the next 5 years, Nokia lost its biggest customers. Verizon dropped them for Samsung, a $6.6 billion contract gone overnight. AT&T followed, awarding Ericsson a $14 billion deal and announcing plans to rip out Nokia equipment across the country. By early 2025, Nokia's mobile networks division had made just €12 million in operating profit, down 89% from the year before. Nokia was running out of options, but they had something Nvidia couldn't build. On October 28, 2025, Jensen Huang held Nvidia's GTC conference in Washington, D.C. He wanted lawmakers to hear this. Even after banning Huawei, America still didn't have a homegrown platform for 6G. The country's wireless infrastructure was built on foreign technology, and Huang intended to change that. Nvidia had spent 2 decades building the chips that power AI, but Huang understood that the next phase wouldn't live in data centers, it would live at the edge. Autonomous cars, robots, drones, AR glasses, anything that needs to make decisions in milliseconds can't afford a round trip to the cloud. The AI has to run where the signal is. The telecom industry is worth $3 trillion, with millions of base stations deployed worldwide, and Nvidia had never built one. For years, Nvidia had tried convincing telecom vendors to build networks on their hardware. Ericsson wasn't an option. Their architecture was built around Intel. Switching meant starting over. But Nokia's infrastructure was different. Their inline design could run AI workloads directly on Nvidia chips without tearing everything apart and starting over. Of the major Western vendors, Nokia was the only one architecturally capable of making the switch. So Huang made his move. He announced a $1 billion investment in Nokia, making Nvidia the company's second largest shareholder. For Nokia, it was a lifeline. For Nvidia, it was a commitment. They weren't just funding Nokia, they were betting their entire telecom strategy on them. Nvidia had the chips, Nokia had the towers. Together, they would build AI RAN, cell towers that don't just move data, but process it. AI RAN changes networks in 2 ways. First, it makes today's networks smarter. By embedding AI into the tower itself, networks can optimize signals in real time, cutting energy use by up to 30% with lower latency and faster response. That matters when 800 million people are already using ChatGPT every week, hundreds of millions of them on their phones. Second, it prepares for what's coming. The next generation of AI, assistants that work on the move, autonomous systems that sense and act in real time, need responses in tens of milliseconds. A data center far away can't deliver that. A tower running AI on the spot can. Nokia CEO called it putting an AI data center into everyone's pocket. Huang made it clear what this partnership meant.
Justin Hodar, the CEO, thank you for your partnership. Thank you for helping the United States bring telecommunication technology back to America.
The market got the message. Nokia's stock jumped 22%, the biggest single-day gain since 2013. T-Mobile signed on as the first customer, with trials starting in 2026. The AI RAN market is expected to exceed $200 billion by 2030, and one analyst predicted that if this works, Nvidia and Nokia could crush Ericsson and take over the whole telecom market. If AI RAN becomes the standard, Nokia won't just be a telecom company anymore. They'll be the backbone of physical AI, the infrastructure that lets machines think in real time. The company that lost the smartphone war is now building the infrastructure for what comes after smartphones. So that is the story of Nokia, a paper mill that became the world's largest phone company, lost everything, then rebuilt itself as a telecom giant. Whether the Nvidia bet pays off is still years away, but Nokia's survival wasn't luck. It came down to 3 decisions. First, sell the thing you're famous for. In 2013, Nokia sold their phone business to Microsoft for $7.2 billion. At the time, critics called it the end of Nokia. Some even accused Elop of sabotaging the company for Microsoft. 2 years later, Microsoft wrote off $7.6 billion on the same business and eliminated 7,800 jobs. Nokia had sold a sinking ship and got paid for it. Most companies hold on to their core business until it's worthless. Nokia let go while it still had value. Second, spend crisis money on the future, not survival. After the Microsoft deal, Nokia had billions in cash. Most companies in crisis would use that to prop up